Good morning, church family. It's great to be able to share with you this morning. And this morning I want to read to you from Galatians 1, verses 11 through 24. It says, "For I would have you know, brothers, that the gospel that was preached by me is not man's gospel, for I did not receive it from any man, nor was I taught it, but I received it through a revelation of Jesus Christ. For you have heard of my former life in Judaism, how I persecuted the church of God violently and tried to destroy it. I was advancing in Judaism beyond many of my own age among my people. So extremely zealous was I for the traditions of my fathers. But when he who had set me apart before I was born, and who called me by his grace, was pleased to reveal his Son to me, in order that I might preach him among the Gentiles, I did not immediately consult with anyone, nor did I go up to Jerusalem to those who were apostles before me, but I went away into Arabia and returned again to Damascus. Then after 3 years, I went up to Jerusalem to visit Cephas and remained with him 15 days, but I saw none of the other apostles except James, the Lord's brother. In what I am writing to you before God, I do not lie. Then I went into the regions of Syria and Cilicia, and I was still unknown in person to the churches of Judea that are in Christ. They only were hearing it said, 'He who used to persecute us is now preaching the faith he once tried to destroy.' And they glorified God because of me." And I just wanted to point out some things in this passage. You'll see in the first 2 chapters of Galatians that Paul is defending, one, the gospel, and then he's defending his apostleship against the Judaizers in Galatia. In verses 6 through 10, we see that he's just finished stating that there is only one gospel and that we don't get to tweak it or tamper with it. Then in verse 11 and 12, which is the beginning of the passage that I read this morning, says, it tells us we see why we don't have the authority to tamper with the gospel, and ultimately that's because it doesn't belong to us. Paul says in there that he didn't receive it from man, he wasn't taught it, but he received it through a revelation of Jesus Christ. So its ultimate origin is Christ, and he received it by the revelation of Christ. Now I want to focus in on verses 15 and 16, because these 2 verses are dynamite. These 2 verses, they're sandwiched between Paul's life before his conversion, and then after these 2 verses, we'll see the way God began to transform Paul after his conversion. And that before is verses 13 and 14, and then after is the second half of verse 16 through the end of the chapter, verse 24. So what's going on in verses 15 and 16? Well, it answers several questions. In just those 2 short verses, we'll see who, what, when, how, and why. First off, who? God. In the beginning of verse 15, we see, "But when God," and that phrase, "but when God," if you see "but God," "but Christ," "but He," "but now," those are great times to pause and see what it's there for. Some of you might be familiar with the term or the saying, if you come to a therefore, you need to see what the therefore is there for. I like to go by that same guideline when I see "but God," "but Christ," "but now." Oftentimes it separates some really bad news from some really good news. So that's the who, God. What had set me apart. We see in verse 15 it says that God had set me apart, speaking of Paul. When? Before I was born. How? called me by his grace. And that's the end of verse 15. And then we see the why in verse 16, in order that I might preach him among the Gentiles. So we see God had set me apart before I was born, called me by his grace in order that I might preach him. These two verses are a quick snapshot of the work that God, or that Jesus personally did in Paul's life on the road to Damascus in Acts 9. That was when Paul was still Saul, and Christ confronted him on the road to Damascus. So what's the result of all this? We see that in verse 24. It says, "And they glorified God because of me." And this isn't for Paul's glory, it's for God's glory. God ultimately gets all the glory. A man who was a persecutor of the Christians, who was actually on his way to arrest Christians and bring them back to Jerusalem bound, when he was confronted by Jesus on the road to Damascus, was radically changed by Christ, and it's a miracle that only God could perform. And I just want to say that, loved ones, if you're in Christ, you've had your but God moment. You've been set apart. You've been called by his grace. You have the privilege of sharing the good news with others that are in your life. Now, if you're hearing this today and you can't say that about yourself, I would urge you to run to the foot of the cross. Nick shared yesterday in service, online service, in Mark 8, he pointed out the part where Jesus asks his disciples a very important question. In fact, it's the most important question you need to answer. He asked them, "But who do you say that I am?" And he talked about three options for that. He could be liar, lunatic, or Lord. And if you believe that he's a liar, he's not who he said he was. If you believe he's a madman, then unfortunately you are still dead in your trespasses and sins. And we would urge you to call out to him. It says in Romans 10:9-10, "If you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. For with the heart one believes and is justified, and with the mouth one confesses and is saved." And then in verse 13 it says, "For everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved." Thomas shared in his daily devotional this past week about the two thieves that hung on either side of Jesus' cross, and the one cried out to him for mercy, to remember him in his kingdom, and Jesus told him that he would be with him today in paradise. The other hurled insults at Jesus. So we see even there the two, just that contrast between the two. We see how one received mercy and one died in his sins. And that's ultimately the question that you need to answer, is who do you say that Jesus is? And then finally, I want to leave you with the words of Ephesians 2:1-10. Where it says, "And you were dead in the trespasses and sins in which you once walked, following the course of this world, following the prince of the power of the air, the spirit that is now at work in the sons of disobedience, among whom we all once lived in the passions of our flesh, carrying out the desires of the body and the mind, and were by nature children of wrath, like the rest of mankind. But God," and there it is, and another example, "but God, being rich in mercy, because of the great love with which he loved us, even when we were dead in our trespasses, made us alive together with Christ. By grace you have been saved, and raised up with him, and seated with him in the heavenly places in Christ Jesus, so that in the coming ages he might show the immeasurable riches of his grace in kindness toward us, in Christ Jesus. For by grace you have been saved through faith, and this is not your own doing. It is the gift of God, not a result of works, so that no one may boast. For we are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God prepared beforehand that we should walk in them. Church family, I love you. And this one a little bit long, but I hope it blesses you, and look forward to seeing you all soon. Thank you.